The Harlan farm sat at the end of a gravel road that the county had never seen fit to pave, 3 miles east of Millhaven, Iowa, in a fold of land that the old-timers called Broken Creek Hollow. It wasn't much to look at from the road, a white-clapboard farmhouse that had been white once and was now the color of old bone, a hip-roof barn with 2 of its ventilators missing, a machine shed cobbled together from corrugated steel panels of 3 different gauges, and beyond all of that, 240 acres of bottomland corn and upland beans that Eli Harlan had been farming by himself since his wife Ruth passed in the spring of 1971. He was 65 years old in March of 1979, though he could have passed for 70 on his worst days and 58 on his best, which were the days when the corn was tall and the sky was clear and there was something mechanical that needed fixing. He stood just under 6 feet, had the kind of hands that looked like they'd been carved out of old hickory, brown and knuckled and permanently grease-stained in the creases, no matter how hard he scrubbed at the kitchen sink. He wore the same style of clothes his father had worn. Dark blue denim bib overalls over a long-sleeve work shirt, a seed company cap, DeKalb, those years, with the little flying ear of corn on the front, and leather work boots that had been resoled twice and were on their way to needing it a 3rd time. He was not a man who talked much, and the town had come to understand this about him the way a town eventually understands all the permanent fixtures of its landscape. You no more expected Eli Harlan to talk freely than you expected the water tower to start dancing. When he came into Dempsey's Hardware on a Saturday morning, he'd nod at whoever was behind the counter, name what he needed in the fewest possible words, pay cash from a worn leather billfold, and leave. If someone asked him how the ground was looking, he might say wet, or coming along, or nothing at all, just a tilting of his chin that somehow communicated everything necessary. The people who knew him best, which is to say the people who had known him for 40 years, which is how long it takes to really know a quiet man, understood that his silence wasn't unfriendliness. It wasn't arrogance. It was something closer to concentration. Eli Harlan was always thinking about something. Usually it was the farm. Usually it was the machinery. The machinery was the love of his life, if you could say such a thing about a man who had clearly loved his wife. But Ruth had understood it. She used to say that Eli's machines were like a second family to him, the ones that didn't talk back and never asked him to explain himself. She said it with a smile, and he'd never argued with her, which might have been because she was right. There were 3 machines in the shed that mattered most to Eli Harlan, and he maintained them with a devotion that bordered on the religious. There was the 1966 John Deere 4020 diesel, which was his main field tractor and which he'd bought used from the Peterson estate sale in 1969 for $2,300, at the time a major expenditure that had kept him awake for a week before he signed the check. There was the 1958 New Idea corn picker, which he'd rebuilt so many times that there wasn't a bolt or a bearing on it that his fingers didn't know by feel. And there was the 1953 John Deere Model R. The R was something else entirely. He'd bought it in 1961, secondhand, from a farmer over in Greene County who was upgrading and couldn't understand why anybody would want the old thing. Eli had paid $350 for it, loaded it on a borrowed flatbed, and driven it home on a Sunday afternoon while Ruth followed in the truck. He'd gone straight into the shed without supper and had been in there until 11 o'clock at night, just looking at it, listening to what it needed. The Model R had been John Deere's first diesel tractor, introduced in 1949, and it was a machine that existed in a category by itself. It was big, bigger than the 4020 in many respects, with rear wheels that stood nearly as tall as Eli's shoulder and a wheelbase that gave it the ground presence of something that had a right to be taken seriously. It had no cab, no roof, no windshield, just an open platform with a metal seat and a steering wheel and the controls, all of it exposed to the sky. What it had, what made it what it was, were 2 cylinders. 2 cylinders. That was the whole engine. Not 6, not 8, not the V8 that the county's shiny new equipment ran on, not even the 4-cylinder that the newer green tractors used. 2 horizontal cylinders, each one the size of a coffee can, firing in alternation with a cadence so slow and deliberate that you could count the beats. At idle, the engine spoke in a voice that was somewhere between a heartbeat and a blacksmith's hammer, a low, resonant, 2-beat pulse that you felt in your sternum as much as heard with your ears. Poppin' Johnnies, folks called them. All the old 2-cylinder John Deeres. You could hear one working in a field a half-mile away, that distinctive pop, 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 drifting over the corn like a message in a language that everyone who'd grown up on a farm in the Midwest understood in their bones. To the young men of 1979, who'd grown up with 4- and 6-cylinder power, who were reading about turbochargers in their farm magazines and listening to the salesman from International Harvester talk about 100-horsepower tractors, as if horsepower were the only thing that mattered in this world, the sound of a poppin' Johnny was quaint at best and ridiculous at worst. To Eli Harlan, it was the sound of something honest. Deere didn't have a lot of horsepower, not by 1979 standards. Its Nebraska tractor test rating from 1949 was around 45 drawbar horsepower, which was respectable for its day, but modest by the time of this story. What it had, what the young men with their turbocharged late-model tractors didn't fully appreciate, because you had to have used one in the mud to understand it, was torque. Low-speed torque of a kind that defied easy explanation. When you put the Model R in its lowest gear and you open the throttle just enough to keep those 2 cylinders firing in their slow, patient rhythm, the machine pulled. Not frantically, not with spinning tires and flying mud, but with an absolute and terrible steadiness, like a mountain deciding to move. The big rear tires, lugged with a tread pattern that dug into the earth like the fingers of a hand, would settle down into whatever footing they could find, and the machine would simply insist. It would insist upon forward motion with a calm, geological certainty that had nothing to do with speed or flash or the kind of power you could show off at a county fair demo. Eli kept the R in working order not because he needed it for every job, the 4,020 handled most field work, but because there were jobs that only the R could do right. Specifically, muddy jobs, wetground jobs, the jobs that presented themselves every year during mud season, when the bottomland around Broken Creek went soft and the gravel roads that served the farms on the east side of the county turned into something that was less road than suggestion. They had a word for it that the farmers had been using since before Iowa was a state: mud season. It wasn't a season on any calendar. It didn't appear between winter and spring on the almanac's tidy pages. It was the unofficial 5th season of the Midwestern year, the one that arrived when the accumulated snow and ice of a hard winter began to release into ground that was still frozen 6 inches down, so that the meltwater had nowhere to go but up and sideways, saturating the topsoil and turning every unpaved road and field approach and low-lying pasture into a treacherous, sucking morass that could swallow a pickup truck to its axles and had been known, in bad years, to take something larger. The winter of 1978 to 79 had been a bad one. The blizzard of January 1979 was one for the record books, not just in Iowa, but across the northern half of the country. Snowfall totals that broke records going back to the 1880s. Drifts that buried fence lines and, in a few cases, buried the fences and the gates and the first 6 feet of the telephone poles along County Road 7. The Iowa State Patrol had closed the interstates twice. The National Guard had been activated in 3 counties to deliver feed to livestock operations that were snowed in. Farmers had lost cattle. Some had lost buildings. When it finally broke, and it broke all at once, the way bad winters do, as if the season had simply exhausted itself, the melt came fast. Too fast. Within 2 weeks in early March, temperatures that had been running 15 below zero at night climbed into the mid-40s in the afternoons, and the snow that had been piled 2 and 3 feet deep across the fields of Millhaven County began to turn to water at a rate that the drainage ditches and tile lines couldn't handle. The creeks ran high and brown. The low fields flooded. The gravel roads, which had been frozen hard as concrete through February, began their annual thaw from the surface down, and the result, as anyone who's ever lived in the rural Midwest knows, was roads that had the structural integrity of warm gelatin. County Road 7, which ran east-west along the south edge of Millhaven County before jogging north to join State Highway 30 near the grain elevator complex, was one of the worst. It crossed 3 low spots where the drainage had never been quite adequate, where water pooled in wet years, and the gravel base became saturated and soft. The county road maintenance crew had put up the seasonal road soft, use caution signs in the usual places, but the signs were small, and the county had never had money to enforce weight limits on roads that served active farms, and so the trucks kept coming and the road kept softening. The world around those roads in 1979 was in the middle of its own kind of upheaval that had nothing to do with weather. The farm economy was running hot in a way that made old-timers uneasy, and old-timers were right to be uneasy, though they wouldn't have been able to tell you exactly why until the bottom fell out in 1980 and 1981. Land prices had been climbing steeply all through the 1970s. Commodity prices for corn and beans had spiked after the 1972 Russian grain deal, and though they'd come down some, they were still high enough that younger farmers were borrowing heavily against inflated land values to buy bigger equipment and more acres. The banks were lending. The equipment dealers were selling. International Harvester had just rolled out its new 86 series. John Deere was pushing its Iron Horse line. Every dealer lot in the county had a row of big, gleaming tractors with enclosed cabs, AM/FM radios, and air conditioning, lined up like a demonstration of everything that farming was supposed to be becoming. The older farmers watched this with mixed feelings. Some of them had borrowed and bought and expanded. Some of them, like Eli Harlan, had done no such thing, had continued to farm what they had with what they owned, had no operating loan bigger than what they needed to buy seed and fertilizer in the spring and pay it back in November. Men like Eli were seen by the younger generation as relics, as people who didn't understand modern agriculture. The salesmen didn't waste much time on them. The banks didn't call them. They existed in the farm economy the way the old wooden windmills still existed in some pastures. Technically functional, obviously outdated, picturesque in a way that made you a little sad. Carter was in the White House, and the Farm Belt had put him there, and it was starting to become clear that putting Carter in the White House had not solved any of the problems that the Farm Belt thought it would solve. Diesel had gone up again. Parts were expensive. The fertilizer the big chemical companies were selling cost more every year, and nobody in Washington seemed to understand or care that the people who grew the country's food were increasingly getting squeezed from both ends. Input costs up, commodity prices uncertain. None of this was anything Eli Harlan discussed in public. He'd voted in every election since Truman, and he had his opinions, but he kept them to himself the way he kept most things to himself. He knew what he knew about farming and about machinery and about the particular piece of ground he'd been working for 30 years, and he got up every morning before 6 and went to work and let the world argue about the rest of it without him. In the first week of March 1979, he was watching the fields come out of the frost with the particular attention of a man who has seen this process many times and has learned that the timing of it matters enormously. The bottomland near Broken Creek was still standing in water. County Road 7, which formed the south boundary of his property, was in bad shape. He'd driven it in his pickup truck on Monday and had made a note to himself to stay off it with anything heavier until it firmed back up. He did not expect to be needed on County Road 7 that Thursday. But then again, he never expected to be needed. He just always seemed to be there when it happened. His name was Dale Kohler, and he'd been driving semi-trucks since 1965, and he knew mud roads the way a sailor knows a storm, by the feel of it in the wheel, by the sound of the tires, by the way the trailer began to track on a wet surface. He'd made this particular run dozens of times, delivering anhydrous ammonia and dry fertilizer from the co-op facility over in Grundy Center to the farms along the east side of the county. And he knew County Road 7 in mud season the same way he knew the narrow bridge outside of Wellsburg or the low-hanging power line on the Sycamore Road. You went slow. You stayed in the center. You didn't stop if you could help it. The truck was a 1976 Kenworth W900, a sleeper cab model that the co-op had bought as a used unit the previous year to handle the increased fertilizer hauling. It was a good truck, a big truck, and it was loaded to the legal maximum with bagged dry fertilizer, 11,000 pounds of it in the trailer, destined for 3 farms along the road. Kohler had looked at the road conditions when he left the facility at 6:30 in the morning and had decided it was passable. It had been cold the night before, down to 26 degrees, which tended to firm up the gravel roads even when the frost was coming out of the ground. He'd done the first 2 deliveries without incident. The third farm was the Brickley place, and to get there you had to go through the worst of the 3 low spots on County Road 7, the one that the locals called the Hollow, where the road dipped down between 2 higher fields and ran for about 60 yards through ground that never fully drained, not in a wet year, sometimes not even in a dry one. On the north side of the Hollow, the road had a slight crown that kept the center passable when the shoulders went soft. On the south side, The crown had washed and rutted over the years until the whole roadbed was more or less flat. Kohler got through the first 60 feet of the hollow all right. He was in low gear, moving carefully, feeling the truck settle slightly into softer ground, but maintaining traction. Then the front axle of the tractor found the soft spot on the south side, the one that had been saturated all winter and had no base left in it at all, and the truck began to lean. Not dramatically, not all at once, just that slow, inexorable lean that every driver who's ever been in this situation knows is the beginning of something that is going to take the rest of the day to sort out. Kohler corrected. The rear wheels of the tractor found the same soft spot. The trailer swung slightly as the back end stepped to the left. He corrected again. And then, in the space of about 4 seconds, the whole combination came to a gentle, decisive, final rest at a 15-degree angle off the road surface. The tractor's front axle buried to the frame in black Iowa mud. The trailer still on the road, but jackknifed at 30 degrees, blocking the entire width of County Road 7. Kohler sat in the cab for a long moment and did what drivers do in these situations. He assessed the damage, confirmed he was uninjured, checked that the trailer load was still secured, and then picked up the CB microphone. "This is eastbound Kenworth on County Road 7 at the Hollow. I'm stuck. I'm really stuck. Anybody got a copy?" The CB crackled. A voice came back, one of the other co-op drivers, running a different route 15 miles to the north. "Copy you, Dale. How bad?" "Front axle's gone. I'm off the road to the right, maybe 15 degrees. Blocking the whole thing. Gonna need something big to get me out." There was a pause. "You call the county?" "About to." He climbed down from the cab and stood in the mud, which came up over his work boots to the ankle, and looked at the situation with the professional eye of a man who has been stuck before. It was bad. The front of the tractor had sunk down and sideways into mud that was black and shiny and had the consistency of cold cake batter, and the more weight there was on it, the deeper it went. He could already see the mud creeping up around the front hub. By the time anything arrived to help him, it was going to be worse. He went back into the cab, called the co-op dispatcher on the radio to report the situation, then walked to the nearest farmhouse, which was Eli Harlan's place, as it happened, half a mile back east on the road, and used the telephone to call the county road maintenance office. He knocked on the door at 7:45 in the morning. Eli answered it in his work clothes, coffee mug in hand, and looked at Kohler with the patient, assessing expression of a man who already knows roughly what kind of news is at the door. "Stuck in the hollow," Kohler said. Eli looked at him for a moment. "How deep?" "Front axle." Eli nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Phone's in the kitchen," he said, and stepped back to let him in. Kohler called the county. Eli went back to his coffee and to the window that looked south toward County Road 7, and stood there thinking about things that he kept to himself. Gary Denon had been the Millhaven County Road and Bridge Superintendent for 6 years, a job he had lobbied aggressively for, and which he performed with the particular energy of a man who understood that his position was political as much as technical, which is to say that the image of competence mattered to him nearly as much as actual competence. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a dark mustache that he'd grown sometime in the middle 70s when mustaches were the thing, and had kept, because he felt it added authority to a face that was otherwise perhaps a little too cheerful-looking for a man in his position. He drove a county-owned 1978 Chevy Silverado 4x4 with a radio in it and a yellow light bar on the roof, and when he got a call about a problem on one of his roads, he moved quickly and with visible purpose. The call about the stuck semi came in just after 8 in the morning. Denton was in the maintenance yard when the dispatcher reached him. He got the particulars, told the dispatcher to hold off on anything else until he could assess the situation, and drove out to the hollow. What he saw when he arrived, at approximately 8:20, was worse than he'd been told. The Kenworth was not merely stuck, it was sinking. The front of the tractor had settled another 4 inches since Kohler had left to use the phone, and the left side of the front axle was now completely below the surface of the surrounding mud. The trailer, still loaded with its 11,000 pounds of fertilizer, sat at an angle that was slowly getting worse. The road was completely blocked, and the temperature, which had been 26 degrees at dawn, was climbing toward the low 40s, which meant the ground was softening with every passing hour. Denton stood at the edge of the road and felt the old familiar calculation running in his head. He needed weight and power and the right geometry of pull. He needed his wrecker. The Millhaven County wrecker was a source of genuine county pride, and Denton was not shy about saying so. It had been purchased the previous year, 1978, as part of a capital equipment program that Denton had pushed through the county supervisors with a slide presentation and a set of carefully assembled cost-benefit numbers. It was a 1978 International Harvester 4370 heavy-duty wrecker, custom-fitted with a commercial-grade boom and winch system, mounted on an IH tandem axle chassis, with a big V8 diesel under the hood and dual rear wheels on each axle, all in highway yellow with the Millhaven County seal on the door. The supervisors had approved the purchase at $148,000, which was a number that Denton had argued passionately for, and which had been reported in the Millhaven Courier under the headline "County approves new heavy rescue equipment," along with a photograph of Denton standing in front of the wrecker with his thumbs in his belt loops and an expression of satisfied ownership. He'd used it on 3 or 4 significant recoveries since the purchase, and it had performed magnificently every time, as he was careful to note in his reports to the supervisors. The V8 delivered 190 horsepower. The winch was rated for 30 tons of pull. The boom extended 22 feet. It was, as Denton was fond of saying, the right tool for the job, any job that was likely to arise on the roads of Millhaven County. He called the maintenance yard on the radio and told them to bring it out. He specified that they should come by way of State Highway 30 and approach from the west, avoiding the soft spots he'd already identified further east. He told them to bring chains and extra cable. He told them he'd have the situation handled by noon. The wrecker arrived at 9:15, driven by Denton's senior equipment operator, a man named Bud Wenzel, who'd been running heavy equipment for the county for 20 years and who had his own reservations about the plan, which he kept to himself because keeping things to himself around Gary Denton was generally the wisest course. By that time, a small audience had assembled. Word travels fast on rural roads in a way that has nothing to do with phone lines or radios and everything to do with the fact that farmers watch the roads. 3 or 4 pickup trucks were parked on the high ground east of the hollow, their owners standing in small groups at the road's edge, hands in pockets, watching. One of them was a young man named Terry Voss, who farmed a place half a mile north and had driven down to see what the commotion was. Another was Ray Dempsey, who ran the hardware store and who happened to be making a delivery to a farm east of here when he saw the blocked road. They watched Bud Wenzel back the county wrecker carefully down the west approach to the hollow, watched Denton walk out to direct the backing, watched them unroll the winch cable and connect it to the front axle of the stuck Kenworth. "That's one big wrecker," Terry Voss said to nobody in particular. "Ought to be what the county paid for it," Ray Dempsey replied. The attempt began at 9:30. Bud Wenzel, at Denton's direction, took the tension up on the winch cable slowly, letting the electric winch take the slack out until the cable was drum-tight and vibrating slightly in the cold air. The Kenworth groaned as the pull came onto its frame. The mud around the front axle sent up a wet, sucking sound. For a moment, one hopeful moment, the truck seemed to shift slightly, seemed to move a fraction of an inch in the direction of the pull. And then Denton made his mistake. He was an impatient man, fundamentally. He'd learned his equipment from sales brochures and operating manuals and from the kind of demonstrations that equipment dealers put on, where the ground is reasonably firm and the loads are staged, where everything is arranged to show the machine at its best. He'd never developed the deep intuitive feel for soft ground work that comes from years of doing it wrong and learning from the consequences. He looked at the slight movement of the Kenworth and decided that what was needed was more power. "Give it the throttle," he said to Wenzel. "Use the engine pull." Wenzel looked at him. "Ground's pretty soft over here, Gary. I think the winch is the right call on this one. Give it the throttle, Bud." Wenzel put the IH wrecker in gear and opened the throttle. The V8 diesel wound up, sending a black jet of exhaust up from the stack, the sound of it filling the hollow with the urgency of a machine that was trying very hard. The big dual rear wheels, 16 of them between the 2 rear axles, each one carrying a portion of the wrecker's own 28,000-pound weight, began to turn. They turned, and in the wet black mud of the hollow's south side, they found no purchase whatsoever. The county wrecker began to dig in. It happened fast, the way it always happens fast once it starts. The spinning tires threw great fans of black mud to both sides, found no solid layer beneath the saturated surface, and began to auger themselves down. Wenzel felt it immediately and lifted his foot from the throttle, but the damage was done. The spinning had broken the integrity of the ground under the dual rear wheels, and now the wrecker's weight was settling into mud that had been churned from something firm into something that was closer to liquid. The wrecker dropped 3 inches. Then another 2. The rear axles disappeared below grade. The yellow paint of the wheel wells was swallowed by the black. Bud Wenzel shut the engine off. The hollow was quiet for a moment except for the dripping of mud from the wrecker's undercarriage and the distant sound of a crow somewhere to the north. Denton stood on the road bank and looked at what had just happened. His face had gone through several colors, the red of effort, the white of realization, now settling into a kind of mottled brick that combined fury and embarrassment in roughly equal proportions. He turned back to the wrecker and walked down into the mud himself, both hands on his hips, looking at the situation with the expression of a man who was very much not going to admit, yet, that the situation was looking at him. Both machines were stuck. The Kenworth was stuck. The county's $148,000 heavy rescue unit was stuck. County Road 7 was not just blocked, it was occupied, thoroughly and completely, by 2 large pieces of machinery that were going nowhere under their own power. The total weight of iron and steel sitting in the hollow was somewhere north of 60,000 pounds, and every minute the temperature climbed, the ground softened, and the numbers got worse. He turned around to face Wenzel, who was climbing down from the cab with the careful movement of a man conserving his dignity. "Don't say it," Denton said. "Didn't say anything," Wenzel replied. Denton got on the radio. He called the maintenance yard and described the situation in terms that were somewhat more optimistic than the facts warranted, and asked what else they had available. The answer was not encouraging. The county's other heavy equipment, a dozer and a motor grader, were both on jobs on the north side of the county and would take 3 hours minimum to get here. The next nearest heavy wrecker was in Waterloo, 50 miles away, and the rental cost would be significant. He stood in the mud and looked at the 2 stuck machines and felt, for the first time in his tenure as county superintendent, that the problem was larger than his tools. That was when Terry Voss, up on the high ground, said, "You know who you ought to call." Denton looked up at him. "Who's that?" Voss nodded east, toward the Harlan farm, visible in the distance as a smudge of white and gray against the bare fields. "Old Eli," he said. "He's got that older tractor. I've seen him pull things out of the creek bottom that you wouldn't believe." There was a short silence. The men on the high ground all knew what Voss was talking about. Some of them had seen the old R at work. Ray Dempsey from the hardware store had personally witnessed Eli drag a stuck grain truck out of this same hollow 3 years ago, on a wet November afternoon when everyone else had given up. Denton's expression made clear what he thought of this suggestion. He was not a man who asked for help from people he considered to be relics. He was not going to be rescued by some old man's museum piece when he had a $148,000 machine sitting right there. "I'll call Waterloo," he said. He went back up to his Silverado and got on the radio, and the wait began. Eli Harlan had watched the wrecker go past his farm at 9:15 from the window of his machine shed, where he was doing early season maintenance on the corn planter. He'd heard the V8 diesel from a quarter-mile away. It had a particular sound, a note that was all about power and speed, that said nothing about patience. He'd noted the direction it was going and had formed a quiet opinion about how the morning was likely to proceed. He went back to the planter, checked the seed disc clearances, replaced 2 worn seed tubes, and greased the bearings on the finger pickup mechanism. He made a cup of coffee in the house at 10 o'clock and stood at the kitchen window looking south. He could not see the hollow from here, but he could hear, if he concentrated, the faint sound of engines laboring, and then the particular silence that comes after an engine stops doing what it was trying to do. He went back to the machine shed. He walked to the far corner where the Model R stood. He put his hand on the rear wheel, flat-palmed against the cold rubber of the lug tread, the way you might put your hand on the shoulder of something you trusted. He stood like that for a moment. Then he walked around to the front of the tractor and checked the pony motor's oil. He checked the fuel. He checked the coolant level in the main engine. He looked at the drawbar and the chain hanging on the south wall of the shed and took the chain down and coiled it over the hitch hook. Starting the R was a ceremony that had its own rhythm, and one that Eli had performed so many times it was as unconscious as breathing, but which he'd never entirely stopped attending to with a kind of appreciation. Deere didn't start on the big diesel engine directly. It used a small pony motor, a four-cylinder gasoline engine about the size of a large outboard motor, to turn the diesel cylinders over until they were warm enough and moving fast enough to ignite. You started the pony motor first, listened to it warm up, then engaged the clutch that connected it to the big diesel's flywheel, and waited while the pony motor spun the diesel up until the diesel caught. It took several minutes. It required patience. It was emphatically not a quick-start machine. The pony motor caught on the second pull. It idled for 3 minutes while Eli stood to the side, hand on the throttle, listening with the attention of a man who knows what he's listening for. When he judged it ready, he engaged the diesel clutch. The big cylinders began to turn. There was a period of several seconds of diesel sound that was not quite firing, just the compression and release of large pistons moving reluctantly in cold cylinders, and then the first real firing stroke hit. A deep, authoritative pop that seemed to come from the ground itself, followed 2 seconds later by the second cylinder, pop, and then they were running. The diesel settled into its rhythm, slow and implacable and sure, and the machine shed filled with the particular quality of sound and vibration that had been filling machine sheds across the Midwest since 1949. Pop, 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 pop. He backed it out of the shed and let it warm up in the yard, then went inside and changed into his rubber boots and his heavy canvas coat. He filled his thermos with coffee from the pot on the stove. He came back out and looked at the sky, which was clear and pale blue, the kind of sky that promised warming temperatures and therefore a ground that was going to keep getting softer as the day went on. He looked south toward County Road 7. He was not a man who hurried, but he understood when waiting too long had its own costs. At 10:45, Terry Voss pulled into his yard in a pickup truck. "Eli," Voss said through the window, "they're stuck good out there. Both the semi and the county wrecker. Denton's called Waterloo, but they said 3 hours minimum." Eli stood by the R and looked at Voss with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously. That he was aware of the situation, that he had been aware of it for some time, and that he had already made his decision about his role in it. "I know it," he said. Voss looked at the R idling in the yard. "You going to go down there?" Eli considered the question for a moment, as if it were more complicated than it appeared. "Somebody ought to," he said. He climbed up onto the open platform of the R, settled into the metal seat, with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent thousands of hours in that exact position, took the hand throttle and moved it up 1 notch, and released the brake. The tractor moved forward at its customary unhurried pace toward the south end of his property and County Road 7. Voss watched him go, then turned his truck around and drove back to the hollow ahead of him to make sure everyone knew what was coming. By 11 o'clock, the small audience at the hollow had grown. Word had moved up and down the road in the way that rural word moves, which is faster than you'd think and has nothing to do with telephones. There were now 7 or 8 vehicles parked on the high ground east of the hollow, and their occupants, farmers and a few of their wives. The mailman who had encountered the roadblock an hour into his route, a young man from the Courier who had heard something on the police scanner and driven out to investigate, were standing in a loose semicircle at the road's edge, watching Denton pace and talk on the radio and stare at the 2 stuck machines with the expression of a man contemplating his professional legacy. The Kenworth had sunk another inch in the time since Kohler had last checked it. The county wrecker had not sunk further, which was about the only positive development of the morning. Denton had spoken to Waterloo twice. The first estimate was 3.5 hours. A second outfit, at a different number, wanted 4 hours and significantly more money. He was considering his options, which were becoming fewer as the morning wore on and the temperature climbed. Bud Wenzel sat on the running board of the wrecker and drank coffee from his thermos and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has communicated his disagreement in the only way he intends to, which in this case was not allowed at all. The sound reached the hollow before the machine did. It came from the east, from the direction of the Harlan farm, drifting over the flat ground in the still spring air with the particular carrying quality of a sound that is low in frequency and steady in rhythm. Most of the people standing at the edge of the road heard it at the same moment and turned to look in the same direction, though there was nothing to see yet, just the straight gray line of County Road 7 disappearing between the bare fields toward the horizon. Pop, pop, pop. Terry Voss, who had just arrived back from Eli's yard, said quietly, "Here he comes." Ray Dempsey from the hardware store put his hands in his pockets and allowed himself a small smile that he made no effort to suppress. The Model R came around the slight bend in the road 300 yards east of the hollow at its usual road pace, which was not fast. It moved with the methodical certainty of something that has never had a reason to hurry and doesn't intend to start now. Eli Harlan sat on the open platform in his canvas coat and DeKalb seed cap, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on his knee, completely upright, his posture suggesting neither urgency nor leisure, but simply the natural ease of a man exactly where he is supposed to be. The two big rear tires, each one nearly 5 feet in diameter, rolled over the wet gravel with quiet authority. The chain hung from the drawbar. The two cylinders fired their slow, patient rhythm into the still air. People moved out of the way as it approached. The mailman, who was from town and had never seen a working Model R up close, watched it with an expression somewhere between bewilderment and genuine fascination. The young reporter from the Courier got out a small spiral notebook. Denton, who had been on the radio in his Silverado, heard the sound and came to the window and watched the R approach with an expression that he arranged into dismissiveness, though maintaining it required more effort than he expected. Eli brought the tractor to a stop on the solid ground east of the hollow and set the brake. He climbed down with the deliberate care of a 65-year-old man who has been climbing on and off tractors for 40 years and has learned not to rush the dismount. He stood next to the R for a moment, and he looked at the hollow. He looked at the Kenworth. He looked at the county wrecker. He looked at the roadbed, at the tracks the wrecker's wheels had left, at the sheen of water standing in the churn marks, at the angle of both vehicles and the depth to which they'd sunk. He was doing calculations, but they were the kind of calculations that don't involve numbers, that are done in the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime, and they took about 45 seconds. Then Denton walked over. "Harlan," he said. The tone was the one he used for people who had appeared when not specifically called. "I've got Waterloo coming. I've got it handled." Eli looked at him without any discernible change in expression. "When are they getting here?" 3 hours. 3.5. I'm working on it." Eli nodded slowly. He looked back at the hollow. He looked at where the road surface was firm and where it was not, reading the ground the way a river pilot reads the current. "Fertilizer's leaking," he said. Denton looked. One of the bags in the trailer had been punctured, apparently by the edge of the trailer frame when it jackknifed it. A pale trickle of dry fertilizer was running out through the gap in the trailer door, mixing with the muddy water on the road surface. "I see it," Denton said. "Ground gets any softer by the time your wrecker gets here." "You're not pulling anything out of there today," Eli said. "Not with what Waterloo's going to bring." It was the longest speech Eli had made all morning. He said it without emphasis, without drama, as a plain statement of what his reading of the ground told him was simply true. Denton's jaw tightened. "I said I've got it handled, Harlan." Eli looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, not contempt, not hostility, but a kind of patient recognition of a familiar type of problem. Then he looked back at the hollow. "All right," he said. He turned back toward the R. And Gary Denton, standing there looking at 2 stuck machines and 3.5 hours of waiting and a temperature that was going to keep climbing until mid-afternoon, had the first genuine moment of honest doubt he'd experienced all morning. "Wait," he said. Eli stopped. "What would you do?" Denton said. He did not make it easy. There was resistance in his voice, the resistance of a man asking for help from someone he's already dismissed in his mind. But he asked it. Eli turned back around. He looked at the hollow again for a long moment. Then he said, "Hook the R to the cab of the semi. Lowest gear. Straight pull, no winch, no extra cable. Get the geometry right and just pull." Denton frowned. "Your tractor doesn't have," he stopped himself. He'd been about to say, "enough horsepower," but something in Eli's expression made him not quite complete the sentence. "It's not about horsepower," Eli said, simply, as if he'd heard the unfinished thought. "Never has been, with mud." There was a silence. The crowd on the bank was watching and making no pretense of not watching. Bud Wenzel had stood up from the running board and was listening with his arms folded and an expression of focused professional attention. Denton looked at the R, at its 2 cylinders ticking over in their slow rhythm, at the enormous rear tires, at the chain on the drawbar, at the old man standing next to it in his canvas coat with mud already on his boots from walking the hollow. "You've done this before," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Eli said. Another silence. Denton looked at the stuck wrecker, at the county seal on its door, at the number he'd argued for in front of the supervisors. All right, he said finally. Let's see it. What happened next took 47 minutes from start to finish, and it was witnessed by 11 people standing on the high ground at the east edge of the hollow, and it would be talked about in Millhaven County for years afterward, for decades, in the way that certain events get talked about, because they demonstrate something that people want to believe is true about the world, but don't always have evidence for. Eli spent the first 10 minutes of those 47 just looking and walking. He walked the east side of the hollow on foot, stepping carefully on the road surface, testing it with his weight, observing where the water moved when he pressed down and where it didn't, noting which sections of the shoulder still had solid base under them, and which had gone to liquid 6 inches down. He walked around the Kenworth, looked at the angle of its front axle, checked where the weight of the trailer was bearing on the frame, noted the slight forward lean that told him the front axle was loaded rather than lifted. He looked at the direction of pull needed and the geometry of where he could position the R on firm ground and still reach the stuck truck with his chain. He said nothing during any of this. Denton stood 20 feet away and watched, and did not speak either, understanding somehow that speaking would be wrong right now. When Eli had finished his survey, he moved the R. He did not go straight into the hollow. He brought the tractor around to the firm shoulder on the east side, where the ground still had solid base under its gravel surface, and positioned it at an angle that seemed oblique until you understood the geometry he was working with. He was not going to pull the Kenworth straight back the way it had come. He was going to pull it forward and to the left, out of the soft spot, and onto the higher section of road that still had its crown. The angle of pull was approximately 30 degrees off the truck's center line, which meant he needed to be positioned to the left of where the truck was pointing and further forward than anyone watching might have expected. He had Kohler help him thread the chain through the front frame of the Kenworth and back to the drawbar. He checked the connection himself, twice, in silence, bending down into the mud without any apparent concern for his coat or his boots, testing the links, checking the hook set with his fingers, pulling against it with both hands to confirm the geometry of the load path. Then he climbed back up to the R's platform and looked the whole arrangement over one more time from above, which gave him a view of the chain's angle relative to the road surface and the approximate position of the tractor's rear tires relative to the shoulder's solid edge. "You want me to set a snatch block?" Terry Voss called out from the bank. He'd helped with farm recoveries before and knew something about rigging. Eli shook his head. "Straight pull," he said. He looked at the chain. He looked at the angle. He looked at the road surface between the R's position and the Kenworth. He sat for a long moment with both hands on his knees, the R idling beneath him with its steady, unhurried beat, the exhaust rising in a thin vertical column in the still air. Then he reached down and engaged the transmission. Lowest gear. The kind of gear that moves at walking pace, that an impatient man would never use, that requires a faith in mechanical advantage over speed that the entire modern era of agricultural equipment had been arguing against for 30 years. The kind of gear that reminds you, if you've forgotten, that torque and horsepower are not the same thing, and that at very low speeds, in very bad ground, torque is what matters and horsepower is almost beside the point. He opened the hand throttle, not all the way, about 2/3, and released the brake. The R moved forward until the chain came taut. There was no drama in this. The chain just came straight and tight, and the sound of it was a low, metallic singing note as it reached full tension. The two big rear tires, 8 feet of rubber contacting the earth on each side, pressed down against the gravel of the shoulder with the full weight of 3,000 pounds of cast iron and steel, and the deep lugs of those tires found the solid layer under the gravel and held. The engine note changed. Not dramatically, from the outside. What you heard was the same pop, 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 but with a fraction more depth, a fraction more authority, the cylinders working now, converting fuel into force into the slow turning of the drawbar. The engine did not speed up. It did not rev. It maintained its steady cadence with the indifference of something that does not experience strain the way high-speed engines do, that does not know the concept of redlining, that simply converts energy at whatever rate is required and does not complain about it. The chain did not vibrate. It did not go slack and snap tight in surges. It just stayed tight, absolutely and perfectly tight, as if the R had decided to become part of the ground itself. an extension of the solid earth on the east side of the hollow, connected to the stuck truck by 30 feet of chain, and the direction of things was simply going to have to accommodate this fact. For the first 20 seconds, nothing visible happened. The crowd on the bank said nothing. Denton watched. Bud Wenzel watched. The reporter from the Courier had his notebook out, but wasn't writing in it. The mailman, who had been planning to leave 10 minutes ago, hadn't moved. Then the mud around the front axle of the Kenworth made a sound. It was a deep, wet, tearing sound. The sound of something that has been held by suction being asked to let go of what it holds. The mud didn't want to let go. It held for another 5 seconds, 10 seconds, the suction of several tons of vehicle pressed in a saturated ground fighting back against the steady mechanical insistence coming through the chain. In this physics lesson between suction and torque, between the mud's grip and the R's absolute refusal to be stopped, one side was going to yield. The mud yielded. It happened in a surge. The Kenworth's front axle came up out of its hole with a wet, explosive sound, the mud releasing it all at once with a sucking crack that sent a spray of black mud outward in a fan pattern, and then the truck was moving, the front wheels on the surface again, the trajectory of the pull carrying it forward and left onto the firm crown of the road, and Eli was walking the R forward to maintain tension, keeping the chain angle consistent, and the truck was coming, the trailer swinging back into alignment as the tractor moved, and in approximately 15 continuous seconds of steady mechanical persuasion the Kenworth was out of the hollow and on solid ground. Eli stopped the R. He checked the tension on the chain, found it had gone slack, and reached back to unhook it. He did this without climbing down, just reaching back from the platform with practiced ease, his hand finding the hook by feel. Then he sat for a moment. The crowd made noise. One of the farmers on the bank clapped, actually clapped, which was not a thing that Iowa farmers of that generation did unselfconsciously, which meant something. The mailman said something to himself that sounded like an expression of reverent surprise. Kohler climbed into his cab, ran through his controls, and reported from the window that everything was operational. Denton stood on the road surface, mud on his boots and a look on his face that had shed most of its earlier architecture of authority, and he watched the Kenworth sitting on solid ground. Then he looked at the R. Then he looked at Eli. The county wrecker was, if anything, harder. It was heavier than the Kenworth by several thousand pounds, had sunk deeper into the mud because its spinning wheels had churned the ground to a greater depth, and its geometry presented different challenges because it was sitting at an angle, and its own boom and rigging equipment changed the weight distribution in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the outside. Eli walked around it twice. He spent another 7 minutes just looking, just thinking, his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes moving over the machine and the ground with that same quality of unhurried attention. During those 7 minutes, Denton did something that cost him something. He walked over to where Eli was standing at the front corner of the wrecker and said, quietly, out of earshot of the others, "I'd appreciate it if you could get my machine out." Eli looked at him. There was no triumph in Eli's face. There was no, "I told you so," no satisfaction taken in the moment where the county superintendent, who had dismissed him, was standing in the mud asking for help. There was nothing in Eli's expression except the same steady attention he gave to everything. He just looked at Denton for a moment and said, simply, "I know it." He went back to the R. He repositioned it. He did not hook to the wrecker's tow receiver, which would have pulled at the wrong angle and potentially strained the frame of the machine. He had Wenzel help him thread the chain to the front axle crossmember, which gave him the geometry he needed. He and Wenzel worked in the mud around the front of the wrecker in comfortable silence, each anticipating what the other needed, the way men who understand machines work together when they share a language. Eli made the pull in 2 stages. The first stage was a lateral correction. He pulled the front of the wrecker slightly to the right to bring it more square with the road surface, using his position angle to rotate the vehicle on its rear axles like a lever. This took 3 minutes and moved the wrecker perhaps 18 inches, an adjustment so subtle that the people watching from the bank weren't sure at first what they were seeing. The second stage was the straight pull back, the same geometry as the Kenworth pull, the same gear, the same throttle setting, the same patience. At 11:57 in the morning, the county wrecker came out of the mud. It came out with a sound similar to the Kenworth, but louder, owing to the greater depth and greater weight, and the crowd's reaction was louder too. Someone honked a truck horn. The reporter from the Courier was writing quickly in his notebook. Bud Wenzel checked the wrecker's undercarriage, found minor damage to one airline and a bent splash guard, nothing structural. He walked over to where Eli was unhooking the chain and stuck out his hand. 20 years I've run heavy equipment, Wenzel said. That was the finest piece of pulling I've ever seen in my life. Eli shook his hand. He looked mildly pleased, which was as much as his face typically offered. Denton was on the radio, calling off the Waterloo wrecker. His voice had lost the particular edge it had carried all morning. He spoke in the tone of a man making a necessary adjustment to his understanding of things, which is one of the more difficult things a certain kind of man is ever asked to do. Eli drove the R back to firm ground and let it idle while he unhooked the chain and coiled it carefully back over the drawbar. He poured himself the last of the coffee from his thermos. The R ticked over beneath him. Pop, 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 patient as it had always been, indifferent to the drama of the morning, unconcerned with the question of whether anyone had been impressed. Terry Voss came over. That'll be something to tell people about, he said. Eli said. What do you want for it? Denton's going to offer to pay you. Eli was quiet for a moment, looking at the hollow. Tell him to fix the crown on this road before next mud season, he said. That's what I want. Voss laughed. A genuine laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere low. I'll tell him. Eli finished his coffee and put the thermos in the canvas bag he kept on the platform. He looked at County Road 7 stretching east back toward his farm, past the bare fields and the miles of fence line, back to the White House and the hip roof barn and the machine shed where the corn planter was still waiting for its maintenance work to be finished. He put the R in gear. The story made it into the Courier that week, 3 columns below the fold on page 5, under the headline Farmer Rescues County Equipment with 1953 Tractor. The reporter, who was 23 years old and had grown up in Des Moines, did his best to capture what he'd seen. He got the facts right and the technical details mostly right. He spelled John Deere correctly, which was more than could be said for some reporters, and he had the right year on the tractor. What he didn't quite capture, because you can't capture it in 3 columns on page 5 of a weekly county paper, was the thing itself, the quality of what it felt like to stand there and watch it happen. The people who were standing on that bank on County Road 7 in March of 1979, the farmers, the mailman, Bud Wenzel, Terry Voss, Ray Dempsey, most of them would still be able to tell you about it 20 years later. They'd tell it in the way that certain stories get told, with the particular warmth of a memory that has been handled often, that has become smooth with retelling but has not lost any of its essential truth. They'd tell you about the sound of the air coming down the road, that pop, pop, pop in the still spring air. They'd tell you about the way Eli walked the ground before he did anything, just looking, reading. They'd tell you about the chain going straight and quiet, and the mud making that explosive releasing sound. They'd tell you how nobody said anything for those 30 seconds of the pull, how even the people who'd been talking all morning just stood there and watched in silence. The way people get quiet when they're witnessing something that they understand, on some level they couldn't articulate, matters. What they were witnessing, though most of them couldn't have put it into those exact words, was a principle. A principle that the whole arc of agricultural progress in the 20th century had been, in various ways, arguing against, and that the 1970s farm economy was arguing against harder than ever. That understanding what you're dealing with is worth more than raw power. That patience is a form of skill. That knowing the ground under your feet is worth more than knowing the horsepower ratings in a sales brochure. The farm economy that Eli Harlan had spent his life in was changing, and not in ways that were uniformly good. The debt spiral that had been building through the late 1970s would break wide open in the early 1980s, and when it did, it would take thousands of farms with it. Specifically the farms that had borrowed the most, expanded the most aggressively, bought the biggest and newest equipment on the most leveraged terms. The land values that had been climbing since the early 1970s would fall, and they would fall hard and fast, and the farmers who had pledged those values against operating loans would find themselves in a position that the banks and the government and nobody else could fully remedy. It was a generational catastrophe for the rural Midwest, quiet in the way that economic disasters are quiet, devastating in the way that only something you've built your whole life toward can be devastating when it goes. Eli Harlan would not be among the casualties. He had no debt of any significant kind in 1979, and he would have none in 1982 when the crisis hit, and his farm would continue doing what it had always done through all of it. He wasn't wise about money in any philosophical sense. He just understood something about the limits of what he could know and what he could control, which made him cautious about obligations he couldn't see his way clear to meeting. He didn't expand what he couldn't manage. He didn't buy what he couldn't fix. He didn't borrow what he couldn't repay. He didn't spin his wheels at high RPM against soft ground and wonder why he was sinking. These were not fashionable principles in 1979. They would not become fashionable again until after the crash, and then only briefly, until the next cycle of optimism came around, as it always does. But they were his principles, and they showed up in everything about him. In the way he kept his machines, in the way he read his fields, in the way he stood on the bank of the hollow and looked at the situation for 10 minutes before he touched a single piece of equipment. Gary Denton had the road crown rebuilt on the hollow section of County Road 7 the following June, which was what Eli had asked for and which was, in fact, long overdue. He submitted the cost as routine road maintenance in his quarterly report and did not specifically mention why he had prioritized this particular stretch. He remained county superintendent for 3 more years. He was not a bad man, and he learned things in the way that capable people with something to learn will eventually learn when the evidence is presented clearly enough. He never again ran high RPM power against soft ground, and when young operators in his crew tried it, he stopped them and told them why, though he did not always explain where he'd learned the lesson. Bud Wenzel retired from the county in 1983 and went to work part-time for a farm equipment dealer in Grundy Center. He talked about the hollow pole to customers who asked about vintage equipment for years afterward, with a specificity and appreciation that suggested he had thought about it often and that it had stayed with him in the way that rare demonstrations of genuine mastery tend to stay with people who are professional enough to recognize mastery when they see it. Dale Kohler, the Kenworth driver, sent a case of Grain Belt beer to Eli's farm the following Saturday, left it on the porch, and drove away without knocking. He told the story of that morning to other truck drivers for the rest of his career, which was 20 more years of roads and mud seasons and the occasional spectacular getting stuck, and he always ended it the same way. I never heard a sound since that I was as glad to hear as that old tractor coming down the road. Never. Terry Voss, the young farmer who'd been standing on the bank that morning, kept farming the place north of the hollow for the rest of his working life. He bought a used 2-cylinder John Deere, a Model 70, similar vintage to Eli's R, in 1985, partly because they'd come down to almost nothing in price in the wreckage of the farm crisis, and partly because he'd been thinking about that morning in the hollow for 6 years and had reached certain conclusions. He used it for soft ground work and ditch cleaning and the various tasks that big modern tractors are poorly suited for, and he maintained it with careful attention, and in the decades that followed, when someone asked him why he kept an old 2-cylinder when he had perfectly good modern equipment, he would tell them about the hollow, about March of 1979, about the coming down the road in the spring mud with that slow, steady, inexorable pop, pop, pop. He would tell it the same way every time, getting a little quieter toward the end, the way people get quiet when they're describing something they still haven't fully finished thinking about. Eli Harlan farmed his place until 1987, when a knee that had been complaining for 20 years finally delivered its ultimatum, and he gave the tillage acres to a neighbor's son to cash rent. He kept the house and the machine shed and 5 acres, and he spent his late years doing what he'd always done in that shed, working on the machines, the planter and the picker and the 40-20 and always, the R, keeping them in the condition they deserved, which was perfect working order, every bearing greased, every bolt torqued, every system functional and ready for the job it might be called on to do, even when it was becoming less and less likely that any job would call. He died in 1993 at the age of 79, in early April, which was mud season, which seemed to those who loved him like the kind of timing the world sometimes manages when it's paying attention. The Millhaven Courier ran his obituary and mentioned that he was a lifelong farmer, a Korean War veteran, and a member of the Lutheran Church at the east edge of town. It mentioned his wife Ruth, who predeceased him, and it listed the names of his children and grandchildren. It did not mention the hollow. But then, the people who needed to know about the hollow already knew. The Model R went to Terry Voss, per Eli's instructions, along with a single index card in Eli's careful, small handwriting that said, "It needs new rings in the pony motor. Use 30-weight oil in the summer. Don't let anybody run it in high gear on wet ground." Yh. Voss had the card framed. It hangs in his machine shed to this day, on the wall next to the workbench, at eye level, where you can read it without looking for it. If you grew up on a farm in the Midwest in the 1950s or 1960s, you know the sound. You don't have to have been there in the hollow on that March morning in 1979 to know exactly what it sounded like when the Model R came around that bend in the road, because you heard that sound 1,000 times before you were 10 years old. You heard it from the kitchen window when your father was plowing the South 40 and the fields were still too soft for the big tractor, and he'd gone to the shed and gotten out the old two-cylinder, because the old two-cylinder knew how to work in soft ground without making things worse. You heard it drifting across the bean field when your uncle was cultivating his rows on a late May morning when the ground was still holding some of the spring's dampness, and the air was clean, and the smell of turned earth came in through the screen door along with that slow, steady pulse. You heard it idling in the shed on winter mornings when the cold was so deep that starting any engine required patience and ritual and a particular faith. The faith of someone who knows that the machine will start because it has always started, because a man who knows his machine and keeps it properly doesn't have engines that fail to start on cold mornings. It is a sound that exists now mostly in memory, and in recordings that people have made and posted in the places on the internet where farmers and the children of farmers gather to look at photographs of old equipment and remember the men who drove it. You can hear it there, that slow, two-beat pulse, and if you grew up with it, something happens in your chest when you hear it. Something that is not quite grief and not quite joy, but is somewhere in the territory between them, in the country of all the mornings that are gone and all the men who moved through them in canvas coats and rubber boots and seed company caps, their hands already knowing what their minds hadn't yet been asked. Those men, your fathers, your grandfathers, the old farmers who knew their ground the way you know your own name, lived in a relationship with the land and with machinery and with patience that the world has largely moved away from. They knew things that don't appear in any manual and were never written down. They could read a field from across the road and tell you where the tile line ran and where the low spot was going to be wet in a wet year. They could tell you where the water table ran by where the willows grew. They could take a machine apart with their eyes closed and put it back together in the dark and start it in the cold and work it in the mud and bring it home at sunset without having wasted a single motion or made a single decision that didn't come from understanding rather than guessing. What Eli Harlan did on County Road 7 in March of 1979 was not extraordinary, not by the standards of the men he'd grown up among, not by the standards of what those machines, in the right hands, with the right knowledge, could do. It was ordinary in the way that mastery always looks ordinary from the outside. The way the best of anything looks easy precisely, because it is the product of 10,000 hours of doing it until it becomes instinct, until the knowledge lives in the hands rather than the head, and the hands simply know what to do. But it was a demonstration, whether he intended it as one or not, of the difference between knowing and owning. The county owned the $148,000 machine. Eli knew the ground, knew the R, knew the geometry, knew the principle that low and slow and patient beats high and fast and urgent and soft ground every single time, had known it for 40 years, would have told you so if you'd asked him in so many words, though you'd have had to ask him directly, because he wasn't going to volunteer opinions about things he considered obvious. The machine he drove home that noon had cost him $350 in 1961. It was 26 years old when it pulled the county's finest piece of heavy equipment out of the mud on County Road 7, and not one person standing on that bank would have traded what they witnessed that morning for a seat at any county supervisor's meeting or any equipment dealer's demonstration or any other display of the kind of power that comes with a price tag big enough to print in the newspaper. The R would go on for another 14 years after Eli, in the hands of the man Eli trusted it to, and it would pull other things out of other difficult places, and it would continue to tell anyone who listened the same lesson it had always had to offer, the lesson of the ground, the lesson of patience, the lesson that says the world has a bottom to it, and you had better know where that bottom is before you ask your machine to find it. Pop, pop, pop. I am still here. I know what I'm doing. There is no rush. The mud season of 1979 was eventually declared the worst in Millhaven County since 1952. County Road 7 was impassable for 11 days in total. The hollow section was rebuilt with improved drainage in June of 1979 under Gary Dinnan's direction and has not been the site of a significant vehicle recovery since. The 1953 John Deere model R that pulled the county wrecker out of the mud on March 8, 1979 is still in operating condition. It lives in a machine shed 5 miles east of Millhaven, Iowa. On quiet spring mornings, when the wind is right, you can still hear it.